Bienvenidos a todos.
Welcome, everyone.
Vamos a empezar en unos minutos.
We're going to start in a few minutes.
Y ahorita vamos a introducir al...
And right now, we're going to introduce Lena for the interpretation.
Hello, everybody. This is a bilingual message. It will be repeated in English. Good evening. My name is Lena Moran, and I'm here with my partner, Carla Martins. We are with Bridging Voices, and we will be the interpreters for this event. We will be providing simultaneous interpretation between English and Spanish for today's webinar. And a successful virtual bilingual environment depends on all of us, not just the interpreters. So you can help by keeping a few things in mind. Speak clearly to ensure that we can hear you. Please speak at a moderate pace. For our panelists, be careful not to speak too fast, especially if you're reading, so we can keep up. We don't want anybody to miss anything. We do ask that only one person speak at a time, so we don't have to choose who to interpret for. Now the interpretation feature is now on, so at the bottom right part of your screen, you should be able to select the language that you want to hear this presentation in, English or Spanish. You can click on the icon that looks like a globe and make that selection now. If you're on a phone or a tablet, you will need to find the three-dot menu, select language interpretation, and select your channel. If you're having any trouble with that feature, please send a message to the panelists. We can get you some help to resolve that issue. Hola, muy buenas noches a todos. Soy Lena Morana Cereto. Estoy aquí con mi pareja Carla Martens. Somos de la compañía Uniendo Voces y somos las intérpretes para el evento de hoy. Proporcionaremos interpretación simultánea entre el inglés y el español. Un ambiente virtual bilingüe exitoso depende de todos nosotros, no solo de las intérpretes, así que pueden ayudar teniendo en cuenta algunas cosas. Hablen claramente para asegurar que los podamos escuchar. Hablen a un ritmo moderado, por favor, y tengan cuidado de no hablar demasiado rápido, especialmente si están leyendo, para que podamos mantener el ritmo. No queremos que nadie se pierda de nada. Solo una persona debe hablar a la vez, así no tenemos que elegir a quién interpretar. Ya está activa la función de interpretación. En la parte inferior derecha de su pantalla pueden seleccionar. Hay un icono que parece globo, ahí van a seleccionar el idioma en el que desean escuchar la presentación. Si están en un teléfono o una tableta, encontrarán el menú de 3 puntos y seleccionarán interpretación de idiomas y luego inglés o español. Si tienen algún problema con esta función de interpretación, envíen un mensaje a los panelistas y con gusto les podemos ayudar. And now I will ask our host to please make me interpreter as well so we can get started.
Gracias, Lena. Okay.
Thank you, Lena. Thanks, everyone. Welcome to the discussion series on food sovereignty and food justice. This talk is going to focus on food sovereignty and food justice. We have interpretation available for this meeting. And again, welcome everyone. This webinar is being recorded and will be sent after the event with some follow-ups and resources that will be shared during the presentation. We invite you to participate and use the Q&A chat box if you have any comments or questions. We have a support team that can help us. So if you have any issues with the interpretation, let us know and someone will help you. This is the second of 3 webinars on food and agriculture. If you can, please sign up. So we're going to go ahead and start. Shakira,
Hello, bienvenidos a todos. Welcome everybody. So the quick introduction around the Santa Barbara County Food Action Network. We launched towards the end of last year, so we're just over a year old. Our mission is to connect, align, and activate a network of food system actors to develop a robust local food economy, a healthy and just community, a well-stewarded, resilient foodshed in Santa Barbara County. I always tell people when they hear these words that don't make sense, what is a food system actor? That's so jargony. I always say, do you eat? You do? Ah, you are a food system actor. You are activating the food system. All of us are. So we were brought together to scale up and diversify the implementation of the Santa Barbara County Food Action Plan. The plan, which was published in 2016, details 16 specific goals aimed at improving the resilience and sustainability of our local food system. We just closed a round of grant making. The application deadline was midnight last night, and you'll be hearing about the funded projects and other ways to get engaged in the network in the next month. So that's it for me. Back to Alan. Gracias a todos.
Gracias, Shakira o Shakira. En esta plática hablaremos sobre los esfuerzos.
And here we will be talking about the actual efforts in order to institutionalize human justice and ecology and on our local system in order for the opportunities to participate in an economy that's more equitable and diversified. We are going to talk about definitions about sovereignty and food justice, the barriers to food justice, and actions and efforts in the community. We will have time for questions at the end. And we will now have our panelists introduce themselves. We also want to say that Zulema Aleman from CAUSE cannot join us, unfortunately, due to an urgent family matter. But first, we will start with Ana Rosa. Hello, my name is Ana Rosa Rizo Centino. I work for Food and Water Action, and I'm also on the board of directors for Casa de la Raza. I'm happy to be with you all. Being from an immigrant family.
We're just doing introductions right now.
Sí, gracias. Y también el próximo es Daniel.
Yes, and now the next person is Daniel.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Daniel Parra Hensel. I use he, him, el pronouns. I'm a first-generation North American Latinx cisgender male presenting with family origins from Colombia and Argentina. I'm currently sitting at a desk at home wearing a blue t-shirt that says access is solidarity, is disability justice, is love, with a light green wall in the background and a dry erase board and a bunch of books. Just for those of you on the call that's useful for. My work mostly focuses on ecological justice. I teach part-time at the Santa Barbara City College in a permaculture design program where I teach 2 classes in ecological literacy, social justice analysis, and community organizing. I'm also a landscaper and in the process of developing a worker self-directed landscaping company called Cultivated Ecologies. I'm also a consultant and an organizer with farmers and communities in agroecological transition or sustainable food systems change. And I also am a community volunteer member for El Centro Food Justice Distribution Pantry and our Somos Semillas Food Sovereignty Garden project on the Lower West Side. I am calling in from the Arroyo Burro watershed that is full of coast live oaks, bay laurel trees, and sycamore trees, which is nested in Chumash land where I reside as a guest on what is also known as Santa Barbara. And I'm honored and privileged to be here with you all. I'm excited to get into the conversation. Thank you.
Gracias, Daniel. Teresa?
Good evening, everyone. I'm Theresa Romero, and I'm the environmental director with the Ynez band of Chumash. I'm also serving on tribal council for the coastal band of Chumash. We at Ynez are working on food sovereignty in collaboration with our tribal health clinic and our cultural department, and have started an effort to supply food to the community. Additionally, I'm a member of a traditional plant collective where we gather and tend our traditional foods and medicines in our lands. And I'd like to acknowledge that we're on my ancestors' lands. And I come from two villages in our traditional Chumash territory. One is Shalawa, which is in the Montecito area, and the other one is Tipu, which is in the northern part of the county outside of Santa Margarita. And I'm glad to be here tonight.
Gracias, Teresa. ¿Y Andrea?
Hola, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es
Hello,
Andrea.
good afternoon. My name is Andrea.
Soy voluntaria de Lideres Campesinas.
I am a volunteer with Lideres Campesinas, representing the Central Coast in Santa Barbara County. I have 6 years as a volunteer here now. And well, what can I tell you? All the wonderful things that I've learned. And I think that it's a unique experience. Decisions that we can take, many women. Thank you so much.
Gracias, Andrea. ¿Y Suget?
Hola, buenas noches.
Hello, good evening. My name is Suget Lopez, and I have the privilege of being with my partner Andrea here today. She's an extraordinary member of our board of directors. I'm Suget Lopez Ruiz. I'm the director of Lideres Campesinas, and I've been with Lideres for the last 14 years. And for me, it has been a privilege to be able to be part of this network of women and young people who are across the state with a beautiful mission, which we'll be sharing with examples. And what a joy to be here with you all sharing today. Thank you. And I never introduced myself. My name is Diaz Correa, and I'm also a son of immigrants. They are from Sinaloa, and I was born here in Santa Maria in Guadalupe, where I reside. I am a community ambassador for CEC, or Community Environmental Council, and I just graduated last year in biochemic, and I moved back to this county to help the community. And so I'm so happy to speak to all of you. And we're going to go ahead and get started with our first question. For those who are listening, we are going to start with the first question. Don't know if it's going to come up, the poll. Okay, so the question here is, have you heard of the terms food justice or food sovereignty? Yes or no? And since it's a very simple question, just want to explain a little bit. As an example, when I was little, my Spanish was not that good. And for me, it was very hard to speak and connect with my family about what was important to me and my family members. And now that I'm older, there are times where I want to talk about things like justice and the environment. And sometimes I find that it's very difficult to talk about those things because the vocabulary or the words, I just don't know them and I don't know how to use them. And it is a big problem. So we hope to touch on that a little bit today. And the answers here, 80% of the folks that are here on the call have heard these words before, and 20% of the folks have not used those words. And so we really are with people that are familiar with these terms, who have used them. And we are going to try to and so the first question is going to be for Daniel. How do you define food sovereignty and food justice?
Can you hear me? Okay. Well, I get the wonderful opportunity and challenge to define and explain these big terms, but I kind of volunteered for it, so it's my fault. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time just kind of unpacking these concepts and just introducing them, and then we'll get to hear also from some of the other panelists who obviously will contribute a lot to these definitions. So the definition that I really like and borrow from for food sovereignty is from La Vida Campesina, which states that food sovereignty is a global movement of farmers, fishers, indigenous peoples, and landless workers that work to reclaim their power in the food system by rebuilding the relationships between people and the land and between food providers and consumers. Furthermore, it puts the aspirations and needs of those who produce, distribute, and consume food at the heart of the food systems and policies rather than the demands of the market and corporations. So really quickly, kind of the takeaway from that is a lot of focus on self-determination and autonomy in the food system. Whereas food justice is, and I get this from Food First in Oakland organization, is a food justice movement that's also a grassroots initiative emerging from communities in response to food insecurity and economic pressures that prevent access to healthy and culturally appropriate foods. Food justice recognizes the food system as a racial project and the influence that race and class has on the production, distribution, and consumption of food. This is also encompassed within the farm labor work, land disputes, issues of status of class, public politics, and advocacy. So the kind of takeaway of that is addressing food insecurity and access in the food system. Now these terms have a lot of overlap, and there's a lot of things that they share in common. So I don't want to make it sound like there's a lot of distinction and one is better or worse than the other or has more value than the other. But it's nice to kind of flesh out a little bit of kind of what's the unique characteristics of each. And I think in order to understand these concepts as well, it's nice to think around these terms in the sense of relationships versus individuals. And so in this case, the way that I like to articulate is the unit of study that we should be kind of exploring is really not looking at things or elements in isolation, but rather the relationship between two or more things, or the relationship between elements, or the relationship between subjects. So really the relationship is the unit of study. And so it's an interesting question to explore. What is the relationship between food sovereignty, between food justice, and our current food system? So like, what is our current, excuse me, what is our current food system? I call or articulate the current dominant food system as one that's what I call an extractive food system. And what that means is it accumulates and concentrates wealth and power by the exploitation of human labor, by mining for calories rather than growing food, and by demanding overproduction to sell in markets. Therefore, constantly having to seek new frontiers or new land in order to maintain its dominance and then repeat that pattern. In this process, what has happened is the removal of biocultural diversity that used to and still does steward the land in a way that is sacred, rooted in ecology, in peoples and place. So just to kind of go a little deeper, this extractive food system created the conditions by which food sovereignty and food justice would emerge as a response or as a counter movement to the dominant extractive system. So food sovereignty emerged generally in the global south, predominantly out of the struggle of campesina and campesino farmers, essentially to have autonomy and self-determination over the lands in which they originally stewarded. Whereas food justice emerged in the global north in a more kind of urban city context, which was in response to a lack of access to food and the structural barriers that impact predominantly BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and LGBTQIA+ and working class communities. So Both emerged essentially out of struggle, out of response and resistance to an extractive system to both reclaim, redistribute, and grant access to a powerful resource of food and land in our communities and in ecologically and socially just ways. And that's kind of just like my introduction to the ideas and the concepts. And I'm pretty sure we have a lot of other people who can add a lot to that and share more. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel.
Gracias.
Entonces vamos a seguir con la
Thank
próxima.
you. So now we're going to continue with the next question on that. And I want to ask Teresa, how is the sovereignty and food justice in practice?
Well, as a member of an Indigenous community, as Danny had mentioned, it's all about relationship. And it's about having relationship to our food. And for us, it's all about seed. Food sovereignty begins with seed and having access to seed and having it be protected and cared for and build a relationship with that seed and the land that you're putting it in, the soil, and making sure it's healthy soil. It's all about building that relationship. And it's all tied in for Indigenous people. You can't separate us from what is there. So we are integral, and each of us is, to the whole. And we build these relationships to support our land, our culture, our families, our communities, and food is a huge piece of that. And food is medicine. It's how we care for ourselves, how we create wellness in our community. And what has happened is we have been removed from our traditional food sources, and many of them don't even exist any longer, or we have to find access to our traditional food through permission, which just seems, a huge burden to people to have to request access to go gather something that supports your community. And so what it looks like now is we're starting to produce our own food. That's what it looks like to us. And so you have to have land to grow your food. And sometimes the land that you have is not going to support necessarily the food that you want to grow, because it grows in different climates, it grows in different areas. That's why trade was established and why food was sometimes traded. There's coastal foods, there's inland foods, and you have to be able to have access to all of them. And so for us, it's all about access. It's about the seeds. It's about supporting our community. And so with that, we create wellness. And with a well community, we support each other and we build right relationship with everything. And that's what I would like to say about that and what it looks like. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. Gracias. Y ya sé que tenemos
Thank you.
Sigue.
I know we have a few minutes to get. Yes, thank you. In women farm workers, the way we live our roots is by feeding those who have little chickens in their home gardens, and so that way they don't put the bees in extinction. Some of them produce honey. Now more than ever, more of the women farm workers are doing things in their own backyards with items that are important for in their kitchen or even for medicinal purposes. That allows us to avoid chemicals, and there's an exchange between the women exchanging products, things that they create themselves. So they create a very nice relationship towards the earth, water and air, plants, animals. We have a lot of really nice images of this that inspire this relationship. And we continue creating our own recipes for food or medicine. And Andrea's going to share a little bit more about these practices. So some of the benefits that we've seen are fruits and vegetables that are healthier, that are fresh and more accessible. Some people have improved their health because of this. That's improved the children's growth. It's better for the earth. It's good to avoid disease. And we like sharing our experience. Our vision is that us as women farm workers, we're owners of our land. We live with health, and we want our environment to be healthy. We want everyone to have the opportunity to have access to healthy foods, and this comes from our ancestors. We all come from a culture that respects plants, from our culture, from our countries. And that's why we always emphasize ancestral. Thank you, Andrea. So something that I'm hearing a lot is the seed, or how we start is very important. But sometimes also the relationships and how they're connected from the seed to the end. So with that, I want to ask Ana Rosa, what are some of the factors or barriers that that affect people from accessing or creating a fair and just food system? Thank you. Well, there's several factors. One of them is the worry that there might be some sort of collapse some sort of like oil spill. That's why our organization works a lot with that. That any sort of infrastructure, new infrastructure that wants to be built, we know that with oil, there's a lot of oil spills. Those are very common. And that gets into our food streams, our water streams. So how can we stay healthy when those things happen? Another thing that's very apparent is capitalism and the way people that are cultivating this food get paid almost nothing. For example, I used to work with my mom, and she used to be in charge of giving food to each child in the school. But what they paid her to be able to feed her own children was very low. So why is capitalism giving such low wages to the people that are actually providing the food? So that's one of the things that I see as a big problem. Exactly, Ana. Thank you, Ana Rosa. So with that, we're gonna open with the second question for those of you that are listening. The second question is, what are the biggest barriers you face to accessing or creating a fair and just food system? So the options are language and cultural differences. Oh, these are very long words. Racial and ethnic inequities, economics and finance, government and bureaucracy, infrastructure needs, housing and transportation, and limitations of time and capacity. So now we're just going to give about 2 more minutes for people to respond, and we will continue. So take your time.
Y aquí dice Suget algo que yo
And
también.
here Suget is saying also something that I was saying, is that all the problems are barriers. And that is something that is affecting us.
Ok, entonces.
All right. So now we've got the answers. The first one was economics and finance. So that is exactly something I wanted to talk about. We have a few extra minutes. That's what I wanted to talk about how sometimes we talk about language or other barriers that we read, but really economics and class is something that's very important and it affects many people. Right now, we've got about 5 minutes. Is there anyone else who wants to expand on that?
Suget?
Suget? About the things that can help with those barriers? Yes. Well, in women farm workers, women have shared, mostly those that have their own small businesses at home. Some of them, some of the barriers that they have come across, and it would help for them to have is to get support, to be able to get land and water, and so that they can develop their projects their way, with the knowledge they know on agriculture. So funds and other, especially for people that of color or from other indigenous groups that right now they're not represented in those businesses. So programs that are linguistically appropriate on like control of plagues and insecticides, and people that come from other state organizations and they want to give us information, but they want to give it to us in another language that it's not ours. So that is another barrier to be able to use those programs that are public, so that we can grow our businesses. So there's a need also to advance education on growing stuff at home. It doesn't matter how big your home is, you can grow food at home. The consumption of organic food, but really what our women say is something that's natural, not necessarily organic. That's how we communicate that. So support more of those like home orchards and cooperatives. So there's a lot of women that are very independent and they want to do it by themselves, but there's other women who want to do it in a group. So support that, the creation of cooperatives, and open more opportunities in the market for these small agricultures that, for example, this card that's called the EBT. So promote local consumption of those that are producing things locally. So those are some ideas that the women have expressed in their towards representatives, so of how they can support a more just community. And
Thank you so much. And I see that Ana Rosa was also talking a little bit about this community help, that we need to help each other. And without that help, it's very difficult. And so another question for the panelists is, what type of things need to be in place, like policies, norms, or networks, in order for community ownership of our food system to take place?
Y no sé si quieres hablar un poquito de
And
eso.
I don't know if you want to talk about that, Suget, but the question is open to all panelists. Can you say the question again, please? Of course, Ana Rosa. What kind of things, policies, norms, or networks need to be in place for community ownership of our food system?
Creo que lo que compartí anteriormente serían mensajes
I
directos.
think what I shared earlier are kind of like direct messages for those folks who are in charge of laws, of implementing programs. I think that message also goes to them. And I think that in general, it's supporting the ideas that our people have, the women with whom I work with day to day through our network, and others that I have the opportunity to know through other spaces like Via Campesina. We're also members of Via Campesina. They are women and with ideas like amazing ideas from the control of plagues, the rotation of the land, these practices, this knowledge. So it's more supporting those ideas, right? And I know that there's a lot of fear maybe that if we make that transition, many people are going to be left without food. I think that's what I hear sometimes for those big producers, industrialized producers, right? That if we make a change to the agriculture like the one we're talking about right now, then many people are going to be without food. That's kind of like their supposed fear. And that there were a bigger investment in really believing that these practices, these ancestral practices, they're sustainable and they will give, they'll generate for many, many and much more time the necessary foods for all humanity. If we are replicating this on a large scale everywhere, then what they're fearing does not have to happen, right? These industrialized folks, that we're going to be left without access to food if we transition to other practices. So really supporting these local efforts that already exist, right? There are programs anywhere. For example, in Salinas, I know about the Alba group who are fostering small entrepreneurs and other places across. And so more of that, supporting the community in reclaiming that role in agriculture. And all of those ideas need to be brought together like a new Green Deal, right? This can be the investment that our government, local county government, can give for those ideas like the new Green Deal. We are having meetings locally, and this is the local climate network that our organization is part of. And we know that Lideres Campesinas has also been involved in some of these meetings as well. And if you want to be a part of them, to also inform the politic, that we are going to be asking the county for the new Green Deal that's regional through the Central Coast. Thank you both so much. I know that, Suget, as you were talking about, sometimes they are trying to give us that fear. If we're going to change the large system, it will affect us terribly. It will affect us negatively. And we really need to change that stigma. We need to change that and know that food is local, that it's grown locally, and that we shop for it locally. So we need to focus on that, specifically in this county specifically. They produce so much food, and there's so many people that still, within a pandemic, do not have access to food. And that's the fear. And fear is already coming alive. And so with that, I want to ask Daniel, sometimes people think that ecology and the environment are separate from the justice and social movements. Could you talk about how these things are related?
Yeah. So I think it's generally these issues tend to be talked about as if they're unrelated, independent problems with separate solutions. And I think one of the best ways to summarize the connection between ecology and justice is simply what we do to the land, we do to the people, and what we do to the people, we do to the land. We are inextricably linked and connected to the land in our labor and in our day-to-day practices and activity, which was what was mentioned by a lot of the panelists so far. And I think just kind of to one of those points around the fear of maybe, if we transition towards more localized food systems, we won't be able to feed the world. Actually, there are a handful of studies that have shown currently 70% of the food that is grown globally is produced on 30% of the land by smallholder, campesino, peasant, small farmers, whereas 30% of the food that is grown is managed on 70% of the land by conventional agriculture. So we actually are already feeding the world through smallholder farmers and on a fraction of the land that conventional extractive farming operates off. So the question is, how do we transition to support smallholder farmers, because they're already feeding the world? So just like dispelling that myth is so important right off the bat, because people oftentimes think that the industrial food system actually feeds the world, which it does not. And so kind of just like speaking a little bit to that history of like the industrial food system and how it developed, like we really have to look back to the story of the origins of this country and its horrible legacy of social inequity and ecological disturbance that was colonialism and slavery. And I think something that's really easy to miss out on that story, apart from the human cruelty, is also the story of how that's about.
Sorry, Daniel, if you can speak a little slower for our interpreters, thank you.
Absolutely, thank you. I get excited and I tend to go fast, so appreciate that.
Me too.
So the kind of point I was trying to make there was that it's also a story of land use change and of changing of the environment and of the ecologies. So just like really quickly, if we look at the Europeans who colonized North America, they stole the land from a tremendous diversity of peoples and communities who had their own sophisticated understanding of how to grow food and manage landscapes that tended to the environment and the ecologies that allowed them to provide their needs without degrading the soil or the rivers or the forests in which they depended. So when colonists displaced indigenous communities, they also replaced indigenous land management and the environment with these European agricultural practices. So that was like the removal of biodiverse, intact landscapes towards diversity and resilience to simplicity, monoculture, and ecological erosion. And so as a result, we had this new farming system that is, constantly being saturated with pesticides and fertilizers and a form of labor that is unjust and exploitative. And so really what that means is an unsustainable food system requires a steady supply of people without options, people that the system can take advantage of. So what would a farming system look like if every farm worker had alternatives, had the political capital to refuse to be exposed to dangerous pesticides? What would happen if the market for unhealthy processed food, if everyone had access to fresh and healthy whole foods throughout their entire lives? How could polluting industries continue if they had nowhere to pollute, if every community had the clout to refuse and reject the byproducts of those industries? So I think it's our job to seek out the farmers and the organizers and the entrepreneurs on the front lines of the struggle to remake the food system and to learn from them. And I think just to kind of like finish this thought, I'd like to share a quote from a friend of mine and colleague, Gopal Dayaneni, from the Movement Generation Justice and Ecology Project, that says, social inequity is a form of ecological imbalance that will inherently result in ecological erosion. If we are not in right relationship with each other, we will never be in right relationship with the rest of the living world. And that just goes back to the first point of what we do to the land, we do to the people, and what we do to the people, we do to the land.
Right, good. Well said, Daniel. Gracias. Y también la misma pregunta a Ana Rosa. Si puedes hablar
And
de
same
las...
question to Ana Rosa, if you want to talk about relationships, and if you can also talk about the words and the language, right? These problems are very connected, but without the words, it's very hard to connect with our families, with our friends, and the people who make these decisions. So if you can talk about that. Well, I think that's why we are doing those local meetings, because what we want for the policy for this new Green Deal is that it's in a language and the words that the people are using, the words that connect with them, right? Not necessarily the academic words that we like to use that people can't understand, but we need to learn from the people. And that's something that we forget quite often, that we have so much to learn from the people. And that if we ask those who are most affected about those topics, we will have the solutions, right? The politicians need to listen to us, not the other way around. Yes, exactly, Anna. And that's something that I always try to say is that the community, they are already experts in community. They already know the things that affect them. I know that sometimes with me, for example, I studied science for many years, but up until when I started working with CEC, I learned the word environment and in Spanish and other words that maybe I don't use, but it doesn't mean that we can't talk about them. You know, when you go to work, it's hotter. You need to have more water. Our grandparents, right? How do they feel? Do they have an area where to sit where maybe it's not going to be so hot? And yes, it's something that sometimes we want to talk about the academic terms, and that's something that we can try to do more of, is to educate people, because the people who are making decisions use those terms. But sometimes we really need them to take a pause and listen, because people are already experts. They will tell you the things that they need. And we have a little bit of time here on this question, if anybody wants to chime in.
Okay, entonces como maestro,
Well, like a teacher, if you're not going to answer, I'm going to move to the next and last question for our panelists. And the question here for Suge and Andrea: what are some of examples of your network fighting for food justice in our community or other communities that we can learn from? Well, the mission says it all. The mission of Lideres Campesinas is to strengthen the leadership of campesinas so that together we can be the bridge that changes, that gets to the social changes, political changes in our human rights. And over the last 32 years, Lideres Campesinas has fought to try to differentiate violence against women. It could be domestic violence, sexual violence, pay gaps, exposure to pesticides, discrimination, etc. Together, we have learned, we have supported each other, and we have transformed our own lives. For example, me, I have worked in the fields, I have been sprayed with pesticides, I have suffered in a marriage where there was domestic violence that I didn't even know. And here I am now giving you this explanation or trying to educate our community. And I'm no longer ashamed to talk about this. I'm no longer afraid to express myself or to tell my story, because I have learned so much. And we are so together, we get together with the community, and that's our example. That's our story first, so that they can trust in us and they can also have all this information.
Thank you, Andrea. And I want to tell everyone that the Q&A is still open. If you want to put your questions there, we will answer them in the last few minutes. But Suget, if you'd like to continue. I don't know if Ana also wants to share, but I just want to add to what Andrea mentioned. All this we have achieved in collaboration with other organizations, other folks that we call our our colleagues so that the farm workers' voice can be heard, so that all the girls and women in California can be informed and educated, and we feel empowered, and taking advantage of all of our human rights so that we can help our families in our own way, on our own terms, which is basically what we've been sharing today through our own businesses or cooperatives in our own way. Thank you. And I know Ana Rosa, I know you have some good examples about what we're doing. I know you're having meetings in homes about with the communities to talk about this.
Pero si puedes hablar poquito más de
But
eso,
if you
Ana.
can talk about it a bit more, Ana, or other examples? Yes. So these meetings that we've been having at homes for the Green New Deal, we've been having it for about a year in different communities in Santa Barbara, in Santa Maria, in Goleta, and basically it's folks talking about conditions in their own communities and what we can do at a county level to work on that Green New Deal that is based on the communities. A big example we have is that we just won a campaign where we were fighting against 3 companies that wanted to put more than 750 oil wells, and organizations like MyCop and Women Farm Workers and Santa Barbara Standing Rock Coalition, Sierra Club, Santa Barbara County Action Network, and Food and Water Action. Together, we were able to get those companies to remove their proposals to install those oil wells. So we just won that last Tuesday. So now people don't have to worry about oil spills in that can affect their food and water. Thank you, Ana. And the question, I know it's very hard, and there are barriers, as we've been discussing. Everything can be a barrier. We've got many to try to help our communities, but we need to try to focus on those connections, on those relationships, and really to plant the seed of this kind of work. So with that, let's use the last few minutes for the Q&A from the participants. So let's go ahead and get started with Shakira, the director, and the question is in English.
Large agriculture and chain grocers can play a role in building food justice into their business model and or employment policies? And this is open to everyone. At least one. I will call on you. I've done that before.
Hola, perdón, soy Suget.
Hi, I'm Suget. Well, yes, some of them, definitely yes. There are some models, I don't have the details, but I've known that some consumer businesses, they do make a commitment to come to an agreement with producers. Usually we're talking about larger companies that are industrialized, that buy products that they know have been grown in an environmentally or socially sustainable way, but we need to create a way in which we can consume locally. Women Farm Workers is part of a national network trying to involved with a campaign that's that healthier foods. A lot of our folks buy at the dollar store where there's some products that are not very, the food that's there, a lot of it is canned foods, and a lot of us don't like that food. We prefer buying it fresh. so for companies like those to import local stuff, not canned goods or from far away, that could be a way that, like an example, how some of these private businesses have a role in promoting the development of these small agricultural businesses, for example. Thank you, Suget. And we have a question from Angela Reed. She says, I feel that in some more urban locations, it's more accessible in general, but to find foods from smaller farmers in more rural areas, the easiest thing sometimes is just to go to the dollar store. So what would be some of the things that we could try to do so we don't have to buy from the larger distributors? And again, this question is for everyone, and if you don't respond, I'm gonna call on you.
Well, I think that one way to help support smaller farmers is to build locally driven food hubs that can then distribute to local markets. And it supports small farmers. There are some indigenous communities that are creating their own food hubs for distribution. And I think that's one way to bring fresh food to markets, is to build these food hubs in rural communities. In most rural communities, you will find local farmers markets, but again, sometimes it's really hard for people to access those areas. But through a food hub, you can distribute directly to local markets by building the hub through local farmers, local small farmers.
Thank you, Theresa. And I think that really speaks to the, circular economy of, small farmers, and then the consumers who can also purchase small local food. To that, we have a question from Mary Jacob to you, Theresa. Given the importance of seed, what are the mechanisms like rituals or festivals and or institutions like seed banks that promote the saving and sharing of seeds within the community? Is community control of seeds under threat? And if so, from whom? So a few questions there.
Wow, there's a lot there to unpack, actually. So what we do on our own is we are saving our own seed. When we grow food, we're saving our own, we let it go to seed and we save the seed, and we're giving it away to local community members. On the other hand, there's just so much involved with seed right now because of Monsanto and the fact that there are farms that are really trying to protect their seed right now, and it's becoming more and more difficult because of the pesticides being sprayed and the GMO seed, which will pollinate with, cross-pollinate with native seeds. And this is going on all across the country in indigenous communities. But people are still really saving their seed. You go through the Southwest and there's a really strong seed network. And for those out there, you can go to nativeseedsearch.org, and they have wonderful seed that they collect themselves from indigenous farmers that you can buy. And it supports those farmers. So that's one way. And then through the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, they also have a seed saving network, and they actually give seed to indigenous people that request it. So, you know, those are local mechanisms to keep seed and distribute seed. And for those people that can, grow your food and save your seed. That's what I have to tell you. I grow my food, I save my seed, and then I plant with it. And I have a whole catalog of seed. So just grow your food. Thank you.
Yeah, I always like that connection between the symbolism of a seed and then the actual reality and importance of seeds. And I know that with large corporations, with all the pesticides, they're trying to trademark and put actual ownership over seeds and over DNA. And that can be a huge problem. Like you said, when they cross-pollinate, then basically they take ownership of community seeds. And so I definitely know it on the science side that it's a very large issue. It's something that we want to talk more about. But another question from Frank Chen, are there immigrant or indigenous owned farms in this region? The short answer I think is yes, but I want to open up to others to talk about that.
Well, I'm just going to pitch in that we have a tribal nursery that's providing food for our community. So, out in San Ynez, we grow food and distribute it to the community. So yes, and I'm sure there are other indigenous farms out there. I just, locally, I'm sure of it.
Thank you, Teresa. Gracias.
Thank you. And we have about 10 minutes left for more questions. And so want to continue with the next question here. Let's see.
Another question from Ken Falstrom. Do you think establishing community gardens would be a desirable direction to pursue?
I can speak to that a little bit.
Go for it.
Yeah, I think community gardens play a really important role, and I think it's really useful to identify like the different levels and scale that we can participate in sort of the transition. And so, you could identify the scale of the individual, the scale of the community, the scale of institutions, the scale of the farm, the scale of state and federal politics. And so I think, just being clear about which approach you're nesting yourself in. And so community gardens are really powerful to empower those who oftentimes don't generally have access to land and who have been oftentimes taken away from their original land and place of origin where they usually grew food on their own. And so a lot of these communities where these community gardens are located have rich culture and knowledge about how to produce, grow food, save seed, and rituals associated with that. I'm particularly really excited to share about a project that I've been a part of this last year that just had a soft opening in the lower west side of Santa Barbara. It's called Somos Semillas, and it's a BIPOC-led community garden on the lower west side that's about 1/10 of an acre that we just planted. We did a blessing with some Chumash elders, and it was about 15 volunteers that all came in and cultivated the soil, planted seeds and starts, and are going to start developing curriculum in the community. And that's one way to start organizing your community towards food systems change. I think it's really easy oftentimes for us to ask, what can I start doing, rather than who can I start working with or who can I organize with. When you ask, what can I do, you eat organic. When you say, who can I do something with, you start socializing or organizing, mobilizing people towards a political systemic change. So I just think it's really valuable to constantly ask yourself, like, how can I get involved with people towards a movement, towards social end, rather than just like individual change. We need to start with individual change because that's important too. But if we really want to address the scale, pace, and implication of the problem, we need to be able to scale up to systemic change, and that we need to do with communities and organizing.
Yeah, speaking of which, that's why it's really important when we elect people for office that they're not just talking about personal responsibility, that they're talking about that systemic change, right? Because that's why we elect people for office, to create systemic change, not just to put it back on the people about personal responsibility. That's a cop-out.
I completely agree. And I think this is a great time for one anonymous question. Will any of you run for political office? And I think our smiles, will will say enough for that question. We can give an FBI answer of neither confirm nor deny. So we'll move on to the next question there. Another anonymous question. Is it worth trying to organize at the federal level, or should we focus in local and regional communities?
Yo pienso que sí es importante, vale la pena y es importante.
I do think that it's important, that it's worth doing it. I think that Lideres Campesinas is a part of the rural equalization, and with them, we are constantly talking and educating ourselves on that famous farm bill. I don't know how you say that in Spanish, but I think it's very important to do it, especially because of that collaboration that we have with this organization. And since women are receiving support here in California, those who are looking in order to create their own businesses on their way, and they're sharing those challenges. There's a question that says, what happens with water shortage? And so that we can change the way in which we are doing agriculture, well, that's going to take us to improve those climate conditions that we're seeing, and hopefully that will help so that there's a bigger conversation about the water. But yes, it is important, it's necessary for all these topics that we're talking about: access to land, access to water, the seeds, that we also involve and organize. Yes, thank you, Suged. And exactly, I think that's the next question. And this comes from Maria Rubio. What happens with water shortages? And so to ask another question, what is it that we can do and what do we need to focus on?
Ya sé que la agua es algo muy
I know that water is something very difficult. I know, for example, I have a friend that works in geology, and this is a problem that he talks about a lot, the use of water here in the county, and how exactly can we use it in order to have it in 5 years or 10 years, 20, 50, 200 years from now. And what we really need to do is focus on that, right? In those types of years, the hundreds and the thousands. Suge, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about this. No, I was just looking at Maria Rubio, who's saying the follow-up on the community gardens. But I remember in a few conferences that we've gone to recently, they tell us about there's always been a way for the farmers, the ancestral farmers, to adapt themselves to the climate situations, right? And that there are certain crops that don't require so much water. So that shouldn't be an impediment to developing these businesses, with the hope that, as we continue to expand this in question of local crops, operations, more sustainable practices, this will be a benefit to the climate and, bring our water back to our state. But I do know that there are some counties, like in Riverside, where there is a reserved amount of water for agriculture. That's not something that a lot of people know, right? Some people know that. And so it's also educating ourselves, informing ourselves about what exists locally and what's available to be able to support the agricultural businesses and make use of those resources that already exist.
this part in English. Don't let CalGEM grant any more aquifer exemptions to oil companies. Like if we already know that there's an escasez de agua, that there should not be any more aquifer exemptions given to oil companies.
Well said there. And I think that speaks to what we really need to focus on is sometimes is policy because it affects community. So going back to Spanish here, para los últimos 2 minutos
For
que
the
tenemos,
last 2 minutes that we have here, is there anything else that you want to finish or say the folks that are listening that you think they need to know?
Pues a mí me encanta, en algún momento Ana Rosa lo ha
I
estado,
love this. Ana Rosa has given so many examples of how these actions are still continuing. The fight has not ended. And so if you want an opportunity, come into our websites, look at the work that we are already in progress and connect with us, and we will find a way to collaborate because we do need that support. It's information, anything that's needed, right? There's always a way for anybody who's interested to join our different efforts and in community, right? Especially thinking about Santa Barbara area. So that's it. I also wanted to say that I want you to know that Casa de la Raza, along with El Centro and UCSB, we are doing food distribution. And so if you know families who need access to food during the pandemic, let us know, and we can take them food if they are not able to come to the site. I also wanted to say, I know that Theresa, Daniel, and Andrea to finish, I also wanted to say, some of us, we also started a new group. It's called Fresa, and that's exactly what it is. It's the providing the ET support in the farmers markets. And that's exactly what we're trying to do is ask questions to the community about that, about having food that's local, and also to support our community. Theresa, Daniel, Andrea?
I'd just like to say that we do have a really active garden right now and nursery. We post to Facebook. You'll find us on Facebook. We use both Facebook and Instagram to share a lot of our work. So you can find us there. And, you know, our biggest hurdle is always funding. We are completely grant supported. So, you know, we're small potatoes in many, many ways, like most of us. So.
Okay, entonces gracias a todos.
Well, with that, thank you all so much. And to close, I just want to thank everybody to continue in this series for Food Action Network. And in a moment, the webinar will be over. And we are going to upload some questions for you to answer. If you can please put down your thoughts and what you enjoyed the most and how we can make it better in the future. You're also going to receive an email in the next few days with the recording of this webinar and other resources. And we will have part 3 of this seminar on December 3rd. And the link will be there so you can register. They're going to drop it in the chat. Sorry, there's a lot of Spanglish. And to finish, thank you all so much for being here and joining us. And we really are very happy to connect with you all in the future and to talk more about these topics that are important.